mitigation for climate change is all or nothing, and it has to be everything. It cannot be less than every single source of greenhouse gas emissions. Although I say it's a hard nut to crack, I think on the other hand, it's certainly the easiest, most readily available, most immediately effective lifestyle change, so-called, that individuals and families can make.
Good evening. My name is Dora Hargitay. I am one of the co-founders of Animal Rebellion, and I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Peter Carter. Good evening and good morning to you, Peter.
Thank you, Dora.
And for context, just a little bit before we go into this conversation with Peter, we are currently 2 weeks away from a large-scale civil resistance campaign that will bring dairy supply to a halt in the UK for 2 weeks as a means to bring the food system crisis to a level of national conversation and demand the government to support farmers in urgently transitioning away from animal farming as a key solution to the climate crisis, as well as to rewild the freed up land and draw down carbon from the atmosphere and restore biodiversity. So today I invited Dr. Peter Carter to talk about the science behind these demands. And I feel very honored that Peter accepted this invitation. For those who don't know Peter, he is a medically qualified doctor with a background in environmental health policy. He is the director of the Climate Emergency Institute, as well as an IPCC Expert Reviewer and an author. Peter, I would like to start off asking you to talk a bit about your background, about what you do as an IPCC reviewer, and also what does the IPCC do? Why it is such an important source of information about climate? Passing it to you, Peter.
Yeah, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, is recognized as the authoritative voice of science on global climate change. And they do periodic, about every 5 years, very, very large assessments. They bring everything in on situation of climate change and the trends on various emissions, etc., and atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, of course. So I've been for over 10 years now, certainly, doing my best to communicate the science to the public. Now, the climate scientists are the very first to acknowledge that they find it difficult to be public communicators, and because, that's not their job, that's not what they were trained to do. One exception to that would be James Hansen, by the way, the sort of father, now grandfather of climate science. He actually has worked very, very hard to communicate to the public and to communicate to governments, etc. So I got involved in this because I'm a medically qualified doctor, and from England, as you may be able to tell. And I moved to Canada doing family physician's practice, and I've done a lot of emergency work. I found myself in situations where there was a lot of air pollution. And that's because I was in a big industrial center for logging, sawmilling, and pulp mills, producing all kinds of nasty chemicals, as well as air pollutants. So I sort of took on the job of where I was of being the sort of physician spokesperson advocate for the people there, the workers that were being subjected to very, very dangerous air pollution. And that carried on for some years. And then myself with a small group of physicians, we formed what's called CAPE, a very successful organization now. That's the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So when we formed CAPE, that would be over 15 years ago, we decided that number one issue was what was called global warming, and we decided we would take that on. So I did even more research than I'd done on the air pollution, and I became the policy spokesperson for CAPE, and going to the federal government in Ottawa and acting as an expert witness on particular emissions and impacts and mitigation and what we had to do to prevent catastrophically dangerous climate change. So that's sort of my story. I sort of fell into going to conferences and making presentations, and I've done a lot of them. And then also be doing some expert reviews for the IPCC. The last one that I did was the 2018 1.5 degrees C report, which was a really, really excellent report. So that's me in a nutshell, I suppose.
And I remember back in 2018, this report you just mentioned, this 1.5 report, sort of really blew up the issue of climate change, and ordinary people like myself began to understand that this is something that will affect us in our own lives, and it's already affecting people around the world. And the seriousness of climate change sort of hit home, that it's already happening. And you also mentioned climate change being catastrophically dangerous. Would you be able to sum up what is the reality of the situation that we are facing right now? Because I think for everything that we speak about after, and why, for example, people are forced to take action right now, is going to stem from this recognition that there is something that needs to be dealt with and is currently not being dealt with by decision makers, policymakers. Could you give us a bit of a summary on the situation of climate change?
Yeah, a few people have been pointing out for some time that because of our self-induced disruption of the climate and disruption of the oceans, we find ourselves, humanity as a species, facing the greatest, worst challenge that we've ever faced in the whole history of the human species. And it is absolutely extraordinary that we really are still doing next to nothing about it. There's a difference between the food approach and the other approaches of energy. I'm trying to communicate fairly simply. Years ago, I divided the sources of greenhouse gas emissions into two big sources. One source of production of energy and one source of production of food. Now, they were both very large sources. That was recognized many years ago. So currently, we have United Nations climate conventions every year. We're now looking at the 27 meetings of the leaders of the world governments since the IPCC 1992 Framework Climate Change Convention, which is the legal aspect behind this. And we have made no progress at all. We are actually making reverse progress. I should refer to you, absolutely right. The world for me and the world for climate change are completely changed suddenly in the right direction with the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report. I should point out that for at least 25 years, that the most vulnerable, least developed countries had been going to these conferences, appealing that governments drop the 2 degrees C limit. And it's been pretty obvious for many years that 2 degrees C is a catastrophic target. And they were pleading for the limit to be dropped to 1.5 degrees C. And they said, we literally cannot survive if you leaders and governments keep us on this 2 degrees C limit. Keep planning, supposedly, that we're only going to limit to 2 degrees C. So that was the reason why the IPCC was actually asked to do this special report. The scientists to begin with were saying and thinking that there wasn't a whole lot of difference, perhaps, between 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. But when all the world's scientists got all the evidence together, right, it became very obvious, and very obvious to the media. That's one reason why also suddenly everybody was declaring in various jurisdictions, in countries, and small municipalities the world over, that we were indeed in a climate emergency. That had been stated and emphasized back in 2008 by leading climate scientist James Hansen, in which he said, we are actually in a state of planetary emergency because we're continuing to emit greenhouse gases. The situation that we're in today is awful. We have to put our greenhouse gas emissions into immediate and rapid reduction. Now, most of us have known that since 1990, but the IPCC have come forward very strongly on this, which is unusual. In the 25th conference, United Nations Conference on Climate, which was in Madrid, called COP26, the IPCC, which is called COP25, the IPCC always has their chair with the other dignitaries, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the formal opening of these big conferences that go on for 2 weeks. The IPCC chair is Dr. Hassan Lee. He's a South Korean economist. I was pleasantly shocked when in his speech he said, well, you must remember that we have to put global emissions into decline within a year. He says, next year we have to see global emissions going into decline. And then he went on with example after example of why this had to be done on an immediate scale basis. So there's no question that we're in a terrible situation, and we have to act according to the science, and we have to do it immediately. At the last climate conference, which was the Glasgow one, Dr. Lee went even further. He said that we have to put our global emissions into immediate, rapid decline in order to avoid a 1.5 degrees C warming. We can't avoid that now, it's too late. And, he said, in order to avoid a 2 degrees C warming. So that was really great of the chair of the IPCC to make that definite science-based statement at these most important conferences. So what is happening? What's happening is that governments and corporations, the big banks, the world economy, which the world economy runs on, is not only continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions, but they're being emitted faster than ever before. We had a bit of a COVID dip, but last year in 2021, CO2, fossil fuel emissions, which are the ones that are mainly focused on, although methane is being increasingly focused on now by the scientists. So 2021 was a new record of global greenhouse gas emissions, and they're going up still at the same very rapid rate. Not only that, but the 2001 increase was the largest one-year increase ever. So when you ask what kind of situation it is, my first thing is to respond to what we are doing, which is what we are not doing. And what we are doing is pushing emissions faster and faster and faster. Now, if that's not stopped, it's fundamentally and logically obvious that we will turn this planet into an unlivable planet. A word which was actually used in the last IPCC assessment. Actually, in the sixth assessment, the author stated that we have to secure a, quote, livable planet. When you realize that the highly conservative, over-conservative science process for the IPCC says something like that, says the issue is now a livable planet, you know we are in a horrendous situation. So I want to stress that the reason why we're in this horrendous situation is primarily because what our governments are doing with emissions. But heavens, they're still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. They also subsidize the agricultural industry, the meat and livestock industry. It seems that governments like to subsidize all the activities, all the industries that are the worst for humanity on the planet right now, which is absolutely, completely, of course, insane. It's criminally insane. Of course, the big marker of what our situation is, actually isn't the global warming. Everybody's focused on the global warming, but that's not what the marker is. In fact, the United Nations Convention back in 1992 said that what we have to do, what governments agreed to do, was to control the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. They would control those so they wouldn't exceed a concentration that would be dangerous. And as I say, we're going exactly in the opposite way. All our concentrations of greenhouse gases, our main ones in the atmosphere, they're not only still increasing. We get various annual reports. A particularly good one is from the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization. And last year, each of the three main greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Methane is the meat greenhouse gas. Nitrous oxide is the agricultural industry greenhouse gas mainly. Each of those increased faster than they ever have before. And that's the greenhouse gas concentration. A lot of people seem to think that maybe it's hopeful. That when we get to a situation which is totally dire for everybody and food production collapses, then we can fix it. I believe they assume that it's fixable. They talk about reversing global warming, for example. You can't reverse global warming. CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for a couple of hundred years. Methane lasts for 12 years. It's still called by the IPCC long-lived greenhouse gases. And nitrous oxide lasts a couple of hundred years too. So you can't just remove these gases and put things into reverse. Completely impossible. In theory, perhaps we might be able to remove in a net way a little bit of CO2, but it would be a little bit of CO2. There's absolutely no way we can remove any methane whatsoever. There's absolutely no way we can remove any nitrous oxide at all. The situation, of course, as everybody knows, in general in the world, is being made worse by this absolutely horrible war that's going on in Europe, that's going on in Ukraine. And what this has done is that the countries have responded in a tragically typical war-type response. We've got a solution here. What are we going to do? We're going to join the war. We're going to increase, and they're all increasing their manufacturing of these massive weapons now. And that is done using fossil fuels, primarily using coal. And so the International Energy Agency, where I got the statistic of the new record CO2 fossil fuel emissions and the record one-year increase, the IEA has pointed out that last year, and nobody expected this even years ago, coal production was at a record. And of course, as everybody knows, I think coal is the very worst of the greenhouse gases. It's also the very worst of the greenhouse gases because of air pollution from coal, also from oil, but mainly coal. And the latest research is that kills over 10 million people every year. So we have compelling reasons to get ourselves off fossil fuels and replace all the fossil fuels with 100% renewable energy. However, we can do all that. And if our methane stays where it is, we're done for. That's because we've got so much heat in the climate system already. that, and the IPCC had said this years ago, in 2014, I recall. They said that each of the greenhouse gas emissions must be dropped to, quote, nearly zero. So that also is another fundamental statement by the IPCC, which really hasn't been picked up. Incredibly, the fact that for a livable future, for really our survival, our global emissions, and that means CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, have to be put in decline immediately and rapidly. That hasn't been picked up. Regrettably, that wasn't reported in the media at all. That was really bad of the media. So to avoid total climate catastrophe, it's not been realized even by the scientists that you have to stop all your emissions, essentially. You can't just choose one, which is what we've done, which is CO2, and say, okay, we'll get that down to near zero, and then we'll do the others. That's the approach that's been taken, which is bad science, actually. All of these emissions are obligatory global warming agents. They all, yes, they act like an electric blanket around the planet, but they're actually little emitting molecules of greenhouse gas. So the more of those molecules we put up there, and they practically stay forever, then the more heat we've got built up into the system. So you really have started your campaign at exactly the right time, because scientists have, in the past few years, been very concerned and expressed that to the media over and over, because methane is accelerating higher. Methane, the concentration of methane, is now double and 2/3 of its original normal concentration at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So we have put up methane way more than double. We put up atmospheric CO2 50%, which is huge, absolutely huge. So that's very, very timely that you're doing your campaign on informing and persuading people that in order for individuals to play their part in avoiding the looming planetary catastrophe of climate and oceans disruption, they can, on an immediate basis, right? They can stop eating meat. They can stop using dairy in their diet. And also they can stop seafood because, of course, the oceans are being trashed. And the trawlers, these industrial trawlers, are so massive that they are digging up, they're literally plowing up the ocean beds, and that's releasing a lot of CO2, because that's our biggest and best CO2 sink is the oceans. Now, in North America, at least, unfortunately, this isn't right the world over. There has been a great move, and it is a great move, not only towards a vegetarian diet, towards a vegan diet. So wherever we go now in Canada, anywhere, we'll, major place, we'll find at least one vegan restaurant. That's a huge turnaround, socially huge. So the people that, of course, are concerned about climate change, and they say, well, what can I do, right? The very first thing, and of course I've been saying this for years and years and years, yes, the very first thing you can do is to go vegetarian and then go vegan, right? Makes sense to do it in two stages. I think most people would do that. And then you will be not only improving your own health by adopting the best diet for your own personal health and your family health, you'll be doing the very best thing for the planet, because this is an immediate reduction in emissions, you see. We don't have to rely on politics, on governments, on corporations, right, to make the switch to do from food greenhouse gas intensive on from food production that's greenhouse gas intensive, which is the term that scientists are using now, to do that on an immediate basis, right? We don't depend on laws and regulations and stuff. We can just do that.
Thank you so much for that. There are a lot of really key points from here, I think, which are, we are first of all in an existential crisis, which is going to impact everybody. Emissions are rising, although they should be going down, which was very clearly communicated by science. And also we know that the reason why it keeps on rising is because, as you said, there are two main sources of emissions, which is one, energy, and the other one is food production. And I would like to talk a bit about the food production side and also talk about the fact that it has come forward quite a bit in the past few years. So, for example, the IPCC Climate Change and Land Report, I think that was the title, actually talked a lot about meat consumption, and it concluded that it is projected to increase by 14% by 2029, although it should be going down, as you said. But I also wanted to maybe talk about some solutions. So there is this big research, which is, we call this the Oxford research. And this looked at roughly 40,000 farms in 119 countries. And it concluded that global land use would drop by 75% if we had a plant-based food system, which means at an individual level that people would be eating a more predominantly plant-based or vegan diet. But altogether, it requires the overall shift from the current food production, which relies a lot on meat, especially here in the UK. If you look out the window, if you're in the countryside, it's land used for grazing animals, keeping the animals.
Yes.
We transition to a plant-based food system. Again, we could reduce that land use by 75%. And then we could also rewire that land to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and also restore biodiversity. Can you talk a bit about this food production side? What's the potential there and why is it so important?
Yeah, you mentioned the IPC special report on land, which was 2019. And in that report, they had a whole chapter on food security. And for the first time, they put a chart out. And this was a chart of the greenhouse gas contributions of various diets. And vegetarianism was like that, okay? And vegan was out here. It was that much better. And all the other diets were worse on greenhouse gas effect. So it was very, very clear. I mean, you just see it shouting at you in this graph, right? To have any chance of preventing total planetary catastrophe, we all have to, on an immediate basis, switch our diets. Stop eating meat. Stop eating dairy. I mean, many vegetarians actually for years and years and years have actually gone that route. There's nothing unusual about a vegan diet. I mean, a vegan diet is in religious life, it goes back thousands of years. It's still present there in India, although India now is taking exactly the worst possible route on emissions in general, increasing coal. So that's the IPCC's assessment. And so we are in a state of food insecurity. No question about that. No question. And it's coming on fast. The fifth assessment in 2014 by the IPCC said that already there was evidence in the research that climate change was having a negative effect on food production. So they had that in 2014. In the recent one in 2016, it was even stronger. The various regions, they cut it back to various regions that were having their food production was being impacted to a greater extent. Now, world food production is not going down. World food production is going up. It's actually slowed up in the past few years. But what the scientists, and they're doing a great job on this, what the scientists have discovered is that Climate change is clawing back. It's dragging back that expected rate of increase from a highly successful in the terms of calories industrial agriculture. And the reason, of course, for that is the extreme weather events. It was clear when I was a boy in England, I had the great pleasure of living on a farm for some years, an old-fashioned traditional farm. And any of those farmers in England will tell you, if you tell them, well, we're thinking of emitting these greenhouse gases and we're going to make the climate variable, okay, in which we can't really increasingly distinguish between spring, summer, autumn. And what we're going to do is we're going to increase those, what we call extreme weather events. We're going to increase the heat waves. We're going to increase the drought. We're going to increase the floods. We're going to increase the superstorms. And by the time you got to that, our old farmer in England would say, you're bloody crazy, right? Because we're doing all the things that will definitely collapse our agriculture. It's absolutely insane. As a society, we're treating the ability to buy what really a toy is, the ability to buy, latest electronic things and God knows what. We're treating that as more important than having food to put on the table. So in trying to communicate this, for some years, I've been saying, if we continue, and we are doing, if we continue to burn fossil fuels, we're burning the food of our children. We're burning up their food because they will have a greater food insecurity that we have to understand the planet is in now. We're no longer in a food secure situation, despite our brilliant, brilliant agriculture, because climate change changes absolutely everything. And yes, of course, we're looking at 18 million people this year in the Horn of Africa and also Kenya and also Uganda in Africa. We've always known, by the way, that Africa was the most vulnerable of countries to climate change. We've always known that. And that is because they have heat waves and because they are in a multi-year drought. And these droughts are being driven by global warming. So the droughts that we're seeing and the heat waves that we're seeing around the world, we're doing that. We're actually doing that. How do we make a switch from into a vegan diet? Well, I think most people will not have, adopted veganism as they are in North America, which is great. Oh, by the way, meat production the world over is going up, and it's going up quite fast. So we really have to go global with these campaigns. And I really congratulate you because we obviously can't rely on the governments. The governments basically are trying to kill our future. We certainly can't rely on the corporations, obviously, including the massive food corporations like Cargill. We cannot rely on them. They will not act to prevent climate catastrophe. So we're entirely dependent on our own activism, right? On our own campaigns in order to, do the most possible now to protect the future and to do what is most possible for the children all over the world. Because inevitably we're going to see increases in those extreme weather events, even if we, I hope and pray, wisen up and put our emissions into immediate basis decline. The IPCC got good publicity on that in the sixth assessment. They stated that there's no question that all of these extreme weather events are increasing. And there's now no question, because scientists have, in the past few years, done a great job on this, that these increases are attributable to human emissions. So most people, I think, have made the switch on a sort of moral, ethical basis. I did. And I think all my friends, that are vegan, they've all made the switch on an ethical basis. And this is absolutely the right thing to do. The pain and suffering, that our food industries are imposing, on other creatures that have feelings, just like us. It's a horrendous thing. But that should now be reinforced by the absolute definite state of the science. And it's wholly definite, 100% certainty. The IPCC has been saying it for years, that our emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, we must change. And we must change all of our processes, right? Our production of goods and services. We must completely convert them. So just as you're saying, in order to address the methane issue, which is really horrendous, it's going up so far. And as I say, 2.6 times pre-industrial level. I mean, my God, that's crazy. We have to go straight over. Okay, we can't sort of do less meat. That don't work. Okay, we have to make the switch, do the conversion. So I call these conversions. All of the solutions are conversions. Less is not good enough. Okay, less intense is not good enough. It has to be complete. And the same thing applies to everything. The same thing applies to nitrous oxide and industrial agriculture. The same thing, of course, applies to the fossil fuel industry. Same thing applies to transportation. Okay, so you're making the right example. Okay, by number one, having a public campaign, and number two, saying nothing less than a total conversion of the diet is going to save us or have any chance of saving us.
But there seems to be some inconsistency in science here, because what you say, for example, science is very clear. Reduction is not enough. We have to go down to zero on all the greenhouse gas emissions. And I think also a huge part of this is land use. And as you said, the depletion of the oceans and so on. As well as the Oxford research says, we can free up land if we have a plant-based diet. But on the other hand, there are a lot of studies that conclude that a 30% reduction, for example, is the way forward. And I'm looking at the UK's National Food Strategy report, for example, led by Henry Dimley, who has concluded that meat consumption reduced by 30% over 10 years is going to be enough. And that kind of information also comes from the Climate Change Committee. They said that the UK must reduce meat consumption by 20 to 50% in order to reach net zero by 2050. So there seems to be a huge gap between this absolute emergency. We need to get down to zero. We have to essentially change the way we live. And here's the other side saying, we all need to change the way we farm a little bit, have regenerative agriculture, and that's going to be enough. Where do you think this gap comes from? And what's your insight on how we could close this gap and come to some kind of a conclusion here?
Well, you're absolutely right. The research that's being done and the conclusions that the research comes to basically doesn't help at all. Because we have to get off CO2, we have to get off fossil fuels, we have to get off methane, right? It's pretty obvious now. So there are reasons for this. Number one, the main reason is that the scientists have no background in policy. I mean, I'm lucky because I have a big background in policy. I understand how science works, science being presented to governments and policymakers, that being made public. None of that's being done on climate change. So the IPCC, essential though it was, and great though it is not a process which works. It's not an environmental health risk assessment, and it's not a process whereby recommendations are made. Specifically, the IPCC avoids making recommendations. And that's why I was so pleased by Dr. Lee making the powerful recommendation that we had to get down to zero. And he made that because that's how bad things are, right? The other thing is, the science is highly reductionist now, right? And there's nothing more reductionist in science than climate change, right? It's pretty well all done by modeling now. The models are amazing. They're doing more and more modeling, more and more complex modeling. But ending up with if they make a recommendation by saying that, well, this is great, we can reduce emissions. No, reducing emissions is never, ever going to save us, save our children, save our planet. It's what can I make an analogy of? Well, if you go to your doctor, and your doctor says, well, you got your blood work shows you got some kidney trouble, you got some heart trouble, you got some liver trouble, but don't worry too much. We'll watch that, okay? And if your kidneys start showing problems, we're going to work on the kidneys. We have some things that we can do. Or we leave the heart and the liver when things get bad. Okay. No, obviously, your doctor is negligent if your doctor does that. Your doctor is obliged by his profession to apply every remedy, which practically always applies lifestyle changes to our patients, to apply every single remedy, apply to every single failing organ in the body. Today, our planet is in failure. We have multi-system failure of our planet. That's what I have been presenting on mainly to the big science conference, climate conferences. Because through the Climate Emergency Institute, we monitor every month every indicator of climate change. So we're following it constantly. And what I present is I put these all together. That's a natural thing to me. I got my medical background in no policy. You have to put them all together. And then when you look at all of these graphs, all heading rapidly in the wrong direction, the conclusion which I come to is that we are trending. We're on a track to biosphere collapse. And we are. And I think a lot of people are getting that idea now. Certainly, a lot of people know that it's not just the abominable situation in Ukraine that's making it harder for most vulnerable people, particularly in Africa, to pay for food and get food even. It's also climate change because they are we have unprecedented droughts everywhere now, everywhere. The Horn of Africa, yes, that's a drought-ridden region, but they've never known a drought like this. This has gone on year after year after year. It's been the worst drought on their records for many, many, many decades. Right? The southwest of the United States and beyond the southwest is in a mega drought. That's a drought which has lasted years and will last years and years and years in the future. In South America, Chile is in a mega drought. Europe has made headlines every day because the heat in Europe is so strong, coming from global warming, coming from heating up the lower atmosphere and surface of the planet. I never anticipated in my worst nightmares that and I have to admit this, that we'd never get to a global surface heating situation where the land was put into drought and the rivers were dried up. This is unbelievable. They're drying up in South America. They're drying up in the Southwest. The federal government has just imposed water restrictions on all of these states in the Southwest. Texas is in a mega drought. It's acknowledged it's in a mega drought. California has acknowledged it's in a mega drought. And of course, as I say, we knew about it, but China now is in the news, the same situation. I've been watching the actual temperatures, not the temperature increases, but the actual temperatures, which we have great information, of course, from the satellites. And I've noticed every day China, absolutely incredible maximum heat. And now that maximum heat has got to the stage where their crops are failing and their rivers are drying up. The mighty Yangtze River is shrinking, and it's shrinking because of global surface warming and climate change. And you know what's going to happen, right? This, of course, is already rebounding on our ability to produce food, on our ability for crops. And we've known, because I presented on it for decades, that extreme weather events and extreme weather events can occur in combination, and they're guaranteed, at least on a temporary basis, to cut back your crop yields. And there's been great research that has proven that, not only proven that it is that those extreme weather events are cutting back in crop yields, but that the what we call the global north, those crop yields are being temporarily cut back even more than what we call the global south. So the global north has, relying on models that were decades ago, the global north has always thought that we'd get away with climate change, and we are always mentioning the poor billions of vulnerable people in the global south. We're all in the same boat now. I mean, just look at the planet. We're all in the same boat. A paper just came out recently. These are absolutely shocking findings, monumental planetary findings. A great paper using models that says that at 2 degrees C by mid-century, what are called the water towers of the Tibetan Plateau, which provide the water for nearly 2 billion people. EPA wrote a warning on this 10 years ago. They're disappearing. And by mid-century, if we continue on the emissions track that we're on now, they will have collapsed. Those people will no longer have the security of that great water system that their civilization and populations have relied on for thousands of years.
So I would like to go back a bit to some of the solutions we talked about. And there is this groundbreaking report that came out of this collaboration between the IPCC and the IPBS, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They're a really long name. But basically what it does, it's the first time that science, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, looked at tackling climate action and biodiversity together. So this is really significant. And what I found interesting is that in that report, they actually warned against relying on technological solution. And I would love to know your thoughts, because like we established, first of all, there needs to be a rapid reduction on emissions that includes all the greenhouse gases, including methane. So that is relevant to our food production. But how we get there, how we get to that zero, that path is not very clear. And I think what I see a lot, and I think what we all see a lot as a general public, is that the solutions that are promoted are mainly technological solutions. So that's hydropower, solar power, wind power, and so on. And so what this report says is there's a trade-off, and it warns very much against relying on these solutions, which I found really interesting. What do you think is the way to step on this path of reduction in a way that we don't ignore the knock-on effects of using technology? And I would like to just maybe add a note in brackets that it's also related to this plant-based food system transition. So how do we not fall into the trap of using technology that actually just increases the problem or puts the problem somewhere else? What do you think?
Technological solutions is deep in our mindset of, global north industrialized world. Over many, many, many decades, I've actually been involved in, let alone see, what came about to eventually give some improvement to fatal sources of pollution. This goes right back to mercury in Minamata, Japan, decades ago. And there's Love Canal, and you can go on and on and on. And they were only looked at seriously by government, and governments only started considering intervention, government action, when a number of women with children got mad, got really, really angry, because these small groups had been working on this particular aspect, which was polluting their locale. Aaron Brockovich, great example. And they got more and more and more energized because, we got videos of these individuals that are always women, okay? And they got mad, and they confronted the governments, and they compelled the governments to intervene. Nowadays, we have a huge problem with that. Not only do corporations on what they call ideological principle fight tooth and nail any attempt at government regulation, we now have a situation in which corporations have changed our world in such a way that governments are feel reluctant to legislate, because the only answer to this, obviously, is legislation. Right? You have to legislate to stop the subsidies. We'll go on burning fossil fuels as long as governments give subsidies. We'll go on eating meat as long as governments give subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And as long as governments elsewhere give subsidies for people to trash the forests, right? So it's fundamental. And Antonio Guterres had this absolutely right when at his last United Nations special climate conference on climate, he called for the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and what he called, and I refer to again, the greenhouse gas intensive food production. So it's fundamental that those subsidies are stopped. That's government regulation. Governments are very reluctant to regulate now because under the WTO-based economic globalization, corporations have managed to give themselves an undemocratic right and power to actually sue their governments if their governments are talking about regulating a particular issue, particular environmental pollution, and the corporations say, well, we're going to lose profit, we're going to sue you. This is very big now in preventing progress. And I was involved in that decades ago in Canada, making presentations to federal government at the time. And it happened anyway. So we got to push. If people ask me what are the two most important things you can do, or three, I say, number one, you go vegan right away pretty well. Number two, you get politically involved. By that, I mean that you lobby and represent all of your parties, all your representatives, not just the one you like, but all of them. Give them the situation with this regards to climate science. Tell them we are taking the planet down and most of life with it, and tell them that they promised in 2009 to stop subsidizing fossil fuel industries, and they have to stop it now. The same applies to the driver of a lot of our methane emissions, which is the meat livestock industry. It's literally insane, isn't it? We're not making the switch to food production, even though it's an essential switch to prevent climate catastrophe, and even though it's the best switch for our own health, we're not doing it, right? And our governments are not. You see, the governments are not representing the people any longer. I mean, this is no secret. In my lifetime, I've seen the change. Governments represent money. Governments represent the economy, right? Governments represent corporations. And so what does that mean? Well, it means we have to fight even harder and we have to try and attract more and more and more people to do these nonviolent protests, right? Bring attention to ourselves and bring attention to the fact that our governments are literally destroying our future, because that's what our governments are literally doing.
What's the third solution? So the first one was change your diet. Second, get politically involved. The third one, do you remember what it was?
You got it. You got a good mind. Yeah, the third one is you go and look at, no matter how unwealthy you think you are, you go and look at where all your money is, whether it's in investments, banks, stocks, whatever, if it's in just your local bank account. And you must, and you can, say, I want to know the industries that those investments are going to. The vast majority of them will be going to fossil fuel industry. So the third thing is you become a responsible investor. And you get all your investments out of the fossil fuel industry, and you put all that investment into the clean, renewable energy industry. Now, I have to now call that zero combustion. It's no longer zero carbon, because we have this rapidly increasing, horrendous, destructive, unbelievably stupid energy source of burning wood. So we have forests around the world being cleared, made into wood pellets, sent mainly to Europe. The big one is called Drax, where I come from. And they are putting wood pellets in. They're burning wood pellets in the place of what they did in the past, which was burning coal, of course. And the research is that burning wood pellets is every bit as bad as burning coal. And biodiversity, yeah. I wrote a chapter on this some years ago in a book. If you're going to do anything about climate change, you have to include biodiversity. If you're going to do anything about biodiversity, you must include climate change. And the reason is that there is what's called a adverse negative synergy between the two. The worse climate change becomes, the more creatures are forced out of their homes, out of their flight paths, out of their locations, and they're forced to adapt. But of course, they can't make it because it's pretty obvious. They need their own accustomed habitat that they've been molded with. Right? So that's climate change's effect on biodiversity. Oh, and by the way, IPCC says that every single scenario, even the very best scenario, will increase the rate of species extinction. We're in the sixth extinction of life on this planet. The specialists in that field think that it's probably the fastest rate of extinction ever already. And on the other side, if you are not protecting biodiversity, you're not protecting the land, you're not protecting the ecosystems, which you have to do, of course, to conserve species, then you're making climate change worse. Because what you're doing is you're damaging the carbon sinks. And we rely unwisely on these two huge carbon sinks. The land carbon sink is basically the forest, the mighty forest, and of course the ocean. And it's always been our worst fear in climate science. We knew that if we push things long enough and far enough, that there would come a point when the carbon sinks would not be able to sink the carbon that they've been doing, that the carbon sinks would become saturated, and that then, if we carried on, they would actually switch to sources of carbon. Today, we have that happening. Today, the Arctic has switched from a carbon sink to a carbon source. The great Amazon rainforest, yes, in large part because it's being cleared and it's being burned, intentionally burned, right? Huge amounts of carbon dioxide being emitted. The Amazon has switched. The Amazon is no longer a carbon sink. It's now become a small carbon source. And the evidence from the research is that this applies to all the rainforests. We still have the mightiest forest in the world, the boreal forest, which is a circumpolar forest, goes right around the subpolar regions. The boreal is a mighty, mighty forest. It is the largest carbon sink on the planet, except for the oceans. And the boreal forest is drying out. Boreal forest is getting more fires, a lot more fires, and that's simply because of global warming. I mean, the deniers that they still are campaigning, they're still campaigning. They must be very clever because, I mean, how obvious is it? Global surface warming, right? Forest fires, drought, right? I mean, it's heat waves, right? So obvious. High school child can work it out, right? And this will continue as long as you emit these global surface heating greenhouse gases. So absolutely, yeah. And another thing I was very happy to see cooperation was about 5 years ago. The IPCC had a joint meeting with the FAO, with the Rome-based agriculture, UN Agriculture, Food and Agriculture Organization. And they reviewed the crop models together. And this was really good that they did that because the statement that they made was that, well, we think that possibly extension of the growing season with global warming has benefited the temperate northern hemisphere regions a bit, but this is not going to last. This is going to switch very quickly, was their statement. Unfortunately, it wasn't publicized. It seems that most of our best, most important science statements, conclusions don't get publicized. Yeah, and of course, Robert Watson, who was a tireless advocate for the planet, scientist, highly, highly, highly qualified. I mean, years ago, he was the chair of the IPCC, and now he's the chair of the IPBES. And they're doing wonderful work, absolutely great work, all documented. But it's not getting out to the public, and it's not actually getting out to the governments. So we have to do that. That's our job, and it's a great job to do,
And I would like to speak about this last bit, if you still have time to respond a last question, if that's okay, which is exactly about how do we get this out to the public? And I think we have talked about a lot of studies that have come up in the recent years that talk a lot more about this rapid rate of reduction and how important it is. These reports start speaking about the meat industry, dairy industry as part of the problem. So a lot of changes are happening. But at the same time, I think when you sort of scroll to the end of these reports and you see the recommendations, as a summary, you don't really see the big call for this transformative change, the kind of things you just said. How can we encourage scientists to be bold and really speak the truth about how bad the situation is, and then also what is the rate of change we have to make, so sort of the public and science can work closer together and unite over this and create this mass resistance and power to change systems collectively? What do you think about that?
I don't think there's anything more important than that. I've been trying to do that for 20 years. And unfortunately, the worse the impacts have become, the less the scientists have made the recommendations, that have to be made. There's been, just this month, there have been 3 massive, monumental impacts projected by the models on climate change. I mean, 3 planet-destroying impacts. And they explained it all. I mean, it makes terrifying reading. But as you infer, the end of every climate science paper, there's a conclusion, and then there's recommendations. The recommendations were made, but they were only to adapt and to research more. I'm afraid that's a death sentence coming from our leading scientists, because if our scientists aren't going to recommend formally in their papers, it makes life very, very hard for us. What I try to tell young people is that you've got to fight for your survival. You have to literally fight for your future. And your best weapon that you have is the science. So use the science. Now, on that, we have something in which the IPCC and the scientists have been great. That is that they've all come around to 1.5C, all of them. It's in the Paris Agreement, but it's only in the Paris Agreement in sort of a mild, intentional thing. But everybody's absolutely solidly behind 1.5 degrees C, because that is totally disastrous. We all know that. And that's the one thing that they've done. The other thing, though, is that they made this recommendation, which is highly publicized. I'm sure everybody in the climate field has heard of it, that in order to have any chance of 1.5 degrees C, or 2 degrees C now, our emissions have to be cut 50% from 2020 to 2030. So that's it. I mean, that is it. And that's all our emissions, right? CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. In order to have any chance whatsoever to convert our economy so that we can get to what they're calling net zero now by 2050, but net zero, according to the 1.5 degree C report, means virtually no fossil fuel industry by 2050. So we have that very, very solid number to go with, and we've really got to hammer away on that. Look, guys, look, industrialists and everybody who's involved in the food chain here. Emissions have to be cut 50%. We can do this. We can do this. It's actually not difficult to do. We definitely need the cooperation of our governments, but we can force our governments to act, So Extinction Rebellion was a great movement. And your extension of that into animal agriculture, into the food industry, is absolutely essential. And 350.org, I think they were very great in their divestment campaign. And they're still working on that one, right? Divest out of fossil fuel industry. But that should be added, divestment out of the animal agriculture, of the livestock meat industry, right? Divest out of that. If you've got money in Cargill and what's the other, Bose something, or and if you have put it in something else.
So net zero means no fossil fuel industry and the transition away from animal farming. Is that the conclusion?
It's a scientific conclusion. It's documented in the IPCC, right? In both the 1.5 degree C assessment and the recent 6 assessment, right? They have the graphs, right, of CO2, of methane, of nitrous oxide. They're pretty easy graphs to understand, It's emissions of greenhouse gas. And as I say, the 1.5 degree C report, their best case scenario, and of course, obviously I'm talking about best case scenarios here, their best case scenario resulted in, if you added up all they specified oil, gas, coal, they specified it for the very first time. And a 90% reduction in the production of those fossil fuels, which means the end of the fossil fuel industry. It means that over the course of the next few decades, the fossil fuel industry is what is called phased out. Okay. Things are so bad that these these industries, these corporations, and even these governments, I think it's time to regard them as our enemies. I remember Greenpeace actually in 1980s had a very good. They did booklets in those days on transportation and cars and trucks, and the writer said, we have an enemy here, and it's the fossil fuel industry, right? And the same applies to the industry that is deforesting our greatest forests, trashing our greatest carbon sinks at a rapid rate. You have to say something judgmental about this. The scientists avoid this, but we certainly have to. We have to use some powerful words. But the scientists have given us very, very powerful tools to use. I'm doing my best to try and sort of spread this around. But if you start at the 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and then move from there, right? It's just logical and rational what we have to do. Essential it is. Certainly a lot of people are waking up to this. It's essential to understand what I've been calling for a long time, the full and terrible truth. Extinction Rebellion, when they started, they made it very clear they didn't think the governments were telling us the full truth. And they're dead right. And Greta Thunberg, bless her, she made it very clear. She got a pulpit to talk on at the big climate conferences. And she made it very clear that she didn't think that her young generation was actually being told the whole truth about what's going on and what has to be done. You remember Greta saying, in a very angry way, by the way, she's an angry young lady. I remember her saying, look, the governments are telling us that we can put this right by technologies. She was referring to carbon dioxide removal, by technologies that we don't even have, right? They're not even being developed, right? So she was right on with that one. We had a private meeting with Greta at Madrid with some of the scientists. She's one smart lady. Oh my God, she's smart. She understands the science like she totally got it because she studied it, which is what everybody has to do. They could do. Everybody can do what Greta did.
So, Peter, I would like to thank you so much for being so courageous to communicate what you think science should communicate and taking that on. And thank you so much for accepting my invitation to talk about the science behind this campaign and the demands that we have to the government this September. And I look forward to talking to you more and getting this job done together. I think we are onto something really great. Thank you.